I didn't raise my voice when my wife poured a glass of red wine over my suit in front of a room full of powerful people. I didn't walk away either. I just stood there, feeling something much heavier than embarrassment settle in my chest. That moment wasn't about humiliation. It was about being erased in plain sight. And if you've ever stayed quiet while someone crossed a line you helped them draw, you'll understand why this story still follows me. I arrived early, the way I always did, and stood near the edge of the room where no one needed anything from me. Manhattan conference halls all blur together after a while. Polished floors, quiet confidence, people who know exactly why they're there. I knew why I was there too, even if no one else seemed to remember anymore. The deal was valued at $800 million. That number floated through conversations like it meant something about character. I adjusted my jacket, already thinking about how long I should stay before slipping out unnoticed. That had become a habit, staying just long enough to show support, leaving before I took up too much space. When my wife stepped onto the stage, the room shifted its attention in unison. She looked comfortable there, certain, the kind of certainty that comes when people stop questioning how you got where you are. Her eyes moved across the audience, greeting investors, board members, faces that mattered. When her gaze reached me, it didn't pause. It slid right past, like I was part of the furniture. I told myself not to read into it. The speeches went on. Applause came at the right moments. Glasses were raised. I stayed quiet, hands folded, listening to people talk about vision and leadership, as if those words hadn't cost anything to earn. Then it happened without warning. She stepped down from the stage during a break, took a glass of red wine from a passing tray, and walked straight toward me. For a second I thought she might say something, an explanation, a request, even a performance of courtesy. Instead, she tilted the glass and let the wine spill across my shirt and jacket. It wasn't dramatic, no shouting, no sharp movement, just a deliberate motion of her wrist. The liquid soaked into the fabric, warm and slow. Conversations nearby faltered, then picked back up in hushed tones. A few people laughed under their breath. Others looked away, relieved it wasn't happening to them. I didn't move. Someone near us cleared their throat. "I think you're in the wrong place," she said, her voice calm, almost bored. That was all. I stood there while she turned and walked back toward her circle, already reclaiming the room. A server hovered nearby, unsure whether to apologize or pretend nothing had happened. I gave him a small shake of my head. He retreated. The whispers filled in the silence she left behind, not loud enough to confront, loud enough to understand. I had been reduced to a misunderstanding, an inconvenience, a man who didn't know when to leave. For years, I had learned how to absorb moments like that, how to smooth things over by doing nothing, keeping my voice low, telling myself that restraint was strength, that letting things pass was how adults handled conflict. My phone buzzed in my pocket. I didn't check it. Instead, I walked toward the exit, each step measured, careful not to rush. No one stopped me. No one asked if I was okay. The doors closed behind me with a soft, practiced sound. Outside, the city moved the way it always did. Taxis honked. People crossed streets without looking up. The cold air hit my face, sharp enough to cut through the smell of wine still clinging to my clothes. I stood on the sidewalk longer than necessary, watching my reflection in a darkened window. The stain spread slowly, impossible to hide. For the first time, I didn't feel angry. I felt something quieter, a realization settling in. Silence hadn't kept the peace. It had taught everyone else how far they could go. I pulled out my phone then, scrolled past messages I wasn't ready to read, and started walking with no clear destination in mind, letting the noise of the street carry me forward as the evening continued without waiting for me. The phone started buzzing before I made it back to New Jersey. Calls stacked on top of each other, numbers I recognized, and a few I didn't. I ignored most of them at first, letting the vibration die out on its own, then checked a voicemail out of habit. No one asked if I was all right. Every message circled the same question. What did you do? Emails followed the same pattern. Short lines, careful wording. People who had smiled at me hours earlier now wanted distance, clarification, reassurance that whatever happened had nothing to do with them. The story was already taking shape without my input. I had embarrassed her. I had caused a scene. I had overstepped. By the time I pulled into the driveway, my head felt heavier than my briefcase ever had. Inside the house, the air sat still. No one rushed to greet me. No voices drifted from the kitchen. Shoes were lined up neatly by the door, as if order alone could keep things from spilling over. I set my keys down and loosened my tie, noticing the faint stains still clinging to the cuff of my shirt. She wasn't home. That fact landed harder than I expected, not because I needed an explanation, but because it confirmed something I had been avoiding for a long time. Whatever we were managing together no longer included me. Later that evening, her mother stopped by without calling. She didn't sit, didn't ask how the event went. "You should have known better," she said, standing near the counter, arms crossed. No accusation followed, no detail, just the assumption that responsibility belonged to me by default. I nodded once, old reflex. After she left, the house felt larger, less forgiving. I reheated leftovers I barely tasted and scrolled through my phone again. A message from someone in her professional circle caught my attention. "You've always depended on her. This isn't a good look." I set the phone down and stared at the wall longer than necessary. The next morning, I went out early and drove until I found a small cafe tucked between a laundromat and a hardware store. Places like that didn't ask questions. I ordered black coffee and took a seat near the window, letting the noise of other conversations fill the space around me. C2 arrived a few minutes later. He didn't rush, didn't look concerned, just pulled out a chair and sat across from me like this was any other day. "You look tired," he said. "I didn't sleep much." "That makes sense." No sympathy came next. No lecture either. He stirred his coffee and glanced at my hands, still restless even when they weren't doing anything. "People are saying things," I said. "They always do. They think I caused it." "Of course they do." I looked up then. "You're carrying a version of the story that doesn't belong to you," he continued. "But you're the only one paying for it." That settled between us. Not comforting, not cruel, just accurate. I told him about the messages, the silence at home, the way conversations shifted the moment I entered a room. He listened without interrupting, without offering fixes. "You know what's strange?" I said. "No one's asked me what actually happened." "They don't need to," he replied. "They already decided who you are in this." The coffee went cold. People came and went. At some point, I realized I had been holding my breath for most of the conversation. "So what do I do?" I asked. C2 didn't answer right away. He leaned back slightly, eyes steady. "First, stop explaining yourself to people who benefit from misunderstanding you." I nodded again, slower this time. When we stood to leave, my phone buzzed once more. Another message waiting. I didn't open it. Instead, I slipped the phone into my pocket and followed him toward the door, already aware that whatever came next wouldn't be resolved by silence alone. The call came in late afternoon, right when the house was quiet enough to hear the refrigerator kick on. I almost let it go to voicemail. The number looked familiar in a way I couldn't place at first, like a name you remember only after hearing it spoken out loud. "It's been a while," he said once I picked up. His voice carried that Chicago cadence I hadn't heard in years. I didn't know if I should call. We talked around nothing for a minute. Weather, work, the usual warm-up men use when they don't want to sound alarmist. Then he paused. "I heard about the deal," he said, "and I heard your name wasn't where it should have been." That got my attention. He didn't accuse, didn't speculate wildly, just mentioned a rumor floating through old circles, questions about ownership, about who had voting control before the latest restructuring. Nothing concrete, just enough to make me uncomfortable. "People are saying the paperwork doesn't match the story," he added. "I figured you'd want to know." After the call ended, I stayed where I was, phone still pressed to my ear long after the line went dead. Rumors usually bounced off me. This one didn't. It sat there, heavy, because it touched something I had deliberately stopped checking years ago. The laptop came out of the drawer that night. Passwords took longer than they used to. Not because I'd forgotten them, but because I hadn't needed them in a long time. Old folders opened slowly, like doors to rooms I hadn't entered since another version of myself lived there. Emails first. Threads from years back, full of cautious optimism and long nights. Messages where my name appeared alongside words like founder, seed capital, initial control. I read without emotion at first, just scanning, then more carefully. Attachments followed, early contracts, amendments, side letters written in polite legal language that assumed trust where scrutiny should have lived. I remembered signing some of them without reading every line, not out of carelessness, but out of exhaustion, wanting things to run smoothly, wanting to believe the people closest to me wouldn't push where they didn't belong. A notification popped up in the corner of the screen while I was still scrolling. Access denied. I tried again, thinking it was a glitch. Same result. A shared financial account I'd logged into for years suddenly treated me like a stranger. No warning, no explanation, just a quiet lock on the door. The next morning, I tested another one, then another. Each time, the same outcome. Some accounts still worked. Others had been altered just enough to remind me I wasn't in control of the system anymore. Nothing dramatic, no confrontation, just small adjustments made without my consent. At breakfast, I mentioned it casually. "Have you noticed anything odd with the accounts?" I asked, keeping my tone even. She didn't look up from her phone. "Everything's fine," she said. "You probably clicked the wrong thing." That was it. No follow-up, no concern. I let it go. On the surface. Later, I drove into the city for a meeting that had nothing to do with any of this, or so I told myself. On the way back, traffic slowed enough for my thoughts to catch up. Pieces started lining up in ways I hadn't allowed before. Decisions made without me, conversations I'd been excluded from. That moment on the stage, now less impulsive than it had seemed. At home, I pulled out a folder I hadn't opened since the early days. Paper copies. The kind you keep when you don't fully trust digital permanence. I spread them across the dining table and started comparing signatures, dates, language. Patterns emerged. Clauses that shifted authority incrementally. Provisions that only activated under specific conditions. Conditions that had quietly been met. None of it illegal. All of it intentional. A message came in while I was mid-page. "We need to talk about boundaries. This situation is becoming disruptive." No greeting, no signature. I read it twice, then set the phone face down. By evening, the house filled with voices again. Family stopped by. Conversation stayed light until it didn't. "You should really stop digging," her brother said, half smiling. "It's not healthy." "Digging into what?" I asked. "Old stuff," he replied. "You're not involved like that anymore." No one contradicted him. Plates clinked. Someone laughed too loudly at nothing. I stayed seated, hands resting flat on the table, aware of how alone I was in that room. Later, when everyone left, I returned to the laptop. This time, I didn't scroll randomly. I searched with intent. Dates, keywords, my own name. The rumor from Chicago no longer sounded like noise. It sounded like a warning. I copied a few files onto a separate drive, labeling them with neutral names. Nothing dramatic, just enough to preserve what I was starting to see. As the progress bar crawled forward, my phone buzzed again with another notification I didn't open. I watched the screen until the transfer finished, closed the laptop, and carried the drive upstairs, already running through what else I might need to check in the morning. The invitation arrived with my name spelled correctly and my role carefully omitted. That alone told me enough. For years, I'd been listed as a board advisor for a nonprofit tied closely to the same circles my wife now moved through with ease. It wasn't ceremonial. I had built the relationships, brought in donors, kept the place solvent when enthusiasm ran low. This time, the email thanked me for my past involvement and explained that the organization was moving in a different direction. I read it twice, then once more, slower. No call followed. No conversation, just a quiet correction to the record. Later that day, I asked her about it while she sorted mail at the kitchen counter. "They said my presence might complicate things," I said, keeping my voice neutral. She shrugged without turning around. "It's about optics," she replied. "You understand how that works." The phrase landed flat. Optics had always been her word for decisions that didn't need defending. I didn't argue. Didn't ask who decided or when. Experience had taught me those questions only prolonged the moment. Instead, I watched how the shift played out in smaller ways. Messages stopped including me by default. Events I used to attend as a matter of routine were suddenly full. People I'd known for years spoke to me like we were being reintroduced. At a fundraiser a week later, someone clapped me on the shoulder and said, half joking, "Enjoying early retirement?" I smiled thinly and excused myself. The house followed the same pattern. Discussions about finances happened without me in the room. Decisions arrived already made. When I asked for details, answers came trimmed down, vague, as if too much information might confuse me. One afternoon, I tried to log into an account connected to a property we'd purchased together years ago. The screen refreshed, then displayed a notice I hadn't seen before. Ownership updated. Administrative access limited. I called the number listed for support, answered a few security questions, and listened while the representative explained that changes had been authorized the previous week. "You should have received notice," she said. "I didn't," I replied. She apologized in a practiced way and suggested I speak with the other account holder. Dinner that night passed quietly. Plates were cleared. The television murmured in the background. I mentioned the property in passing, the way you bring up weather when you don't want to seem alarmed. "Oh, that," she said. "I handled it. You've had enough on your plate." There it was again. Concern used as a cover for exclusion. I let the topic drop and focused on rinsing dishes, feeling the familiar pull to keep things smooth. That instinct had served me well in other parts of life. Here, it felt increasingly misplaced. The following weekend, her family gathered as they often did. Conversation flowed around me, not through me. Plans were discussed without pause, my absence assumed rather than acknowledged. When I offered an opinion on something minor, it hung in the air longer than necessary before someone changed the subject. Her brother leaned over at one point and lowered his voice. "This is probably for the best," he said. "Less stress for everyone." I nodded, because that's what was expected. Later, alone in the garage, I opened the folder I'd started assembling days earlier. Documents sat in neat stacks, ordered by date rather than emotion. Each one told a small part of the same story. Authority shifting incrementally, consent assumed, silence interpreted as approval. Nothing screamed betrayal. That was the problem. Everything had been done carefully, with enough distance to make objections sound unreasonable. My phone vibrated with a calendar update while I was standing there. A meeting I used to attend monthly had been rescheduled. My name wasn't on the list anymore. I closed the notification without responding and slid the phone back into my pocket. Inside the house, laughter drifted from the living room. I wiped my hands on a rag, turned off the light, and went back in, already noting how many decisions had been made without me that week, and how many more might follow if I kept letting them pass. The email didn't have a name attached to it. No greeting either. Just a subject line that read, "You should see this," and a single attachment. I opened it on my phone first, then stopped myself and waited until I was back in the study. Old habit. Some things deserved a bigger screen and a quieter head. The document loaded slowly, like it didn't want to be found. It was an agreement dated years back, from the early phase of the investment fund I helped start. My signature sat near the bottom, exactly where I remembered it. What I didn't remember were the handwritten notes in the margins, or the addendum stapled behind it. The language was careful, dense in places, but clear enough once I slowed down. Founding contribution, voting rights, contingent control. My chest tightened, not from shock, but from recognition. I hadn't imagined this. I just stopped looking. I forwarded the file to C2 without a comment. He called an hour later. "Where did you get this?" he asked. "Does it matter?" "Only because it changes a lot." We met the next morning in his office, a plain space that didn't try to impress anyone. He printed the document, marked sections with a pen, and slid it across the desk. "You didn't lose your position," he said. "You stepped back operationally. Legally, that's not the same thing." I watched his hand move from clause to clause, explaining what I'd skimmed past years ago. At the time, I trusted the people around me, trusted my marriage, trusted that silence wouldn't be mistaken for surrender. "This addendum," he continued, "it was designed for moments like this. Restructuring, external deals, anything above a certain threshold. Like $800 million, I said. He didn't smile. Exactly like that. On the drive home, I replayed conversations from the past few weeks with a different ear. The sudden confidence she'd taken on. The way people spoke around me instead of to me. None of it was random. It was coordinated. Quietly, but with intent. That afternoon, my phone lit up with messages I hadn't been included in before. Group threads where my name came up without me present. A colleague forwarded one by mistake, then quickly apologized. "They're worried you might interfere." Interfere? With what exactly? At dinner, she talked more than usual. Not to me, but around me. Dropping names, mentioning meetings, laying groundwork. I listened, nodding when appropriate, filing details away. "There's been some concern about your involvement," she said at one point, finally meeting my eyes. "People think you're struggling with the changes." The phrasing was deliberate, concern framed as compassion, doubt packaged as care. "I'm fine," I replied, "just adjusting." That seemed to satisfy her. Or maybe she only needed me to stop asking questions. Over the next few days, the pressure became less subtle. Invitations rescinded, access delayed. A narrative forming that painted me as distracted, emotional, unreliable. Nothing overt, enough to stick. C2 called again midweek. "They're trying to isolate you," he said. "Not legally, socially. It's easier that way." I noticed. "You don't have to respond yet," he added, "but you should decide what you want." That question stayed with me longer than I expected. What did I want? For years, the answer had been stability, peace, a life where conflict stayed manageable. Now, that version of safety looked more like a slow exit. I spent the evening reviewing the document again, then another, then another. Each one reinforced the same point. I hadn't been erased, I'd been obscured. There was a difference. Upstairs, the shower turned on. The sound carried through the house, steady and indifferent. I saved the files to a secure folder, renamed them with dates instead of titles, and shut the laptop. When I joined her in the bedroom later, she was already scrolling through her phone. "Long day?" she asked. "Productive," I said. She nodded, already elsewhere. I lay awake longer than usual, not weighing options so much as acknowledging them. Staying quiet would keep things calm on the surface. Stepping forward would change the temperature of everything. At some point, I reached for my phone and drafted a short message to C2. I didn't send it right away. Read it once more, then hit send and set the phone down, staring at the ceiling as the house settled. Morning routine stayed intact. Coffee brewed, mail collected, small talk exchanged when necessary. On the surface, nothing shifted. Underneath, everything did. Documents started living in two places instead of one. Originals stayed where they'd always been. Copies moved quietly, encrypted folders, offline drives, cloud storage under accounts no one else knew existed. Each file got reviewed line by line, not for emotion, but for sequence. Dates mattered. So did signatures, amendments, the timing of board approvals that never included me. Travel came next. A conference in California gave me cover. No one questioned it. I booked the flight myself, packed light, and left before dawn. At the airport, my phone stayed on airplane mode longer than usual. It felt necessary. The law firm sat in a modest building outside Palo Alto. No grand lobby, no statements on the wall, just quiet efficiency. The attorney C2 recommended shook my hand once and didn't waste time. "Start from the beginning," she said. I did, but not the emotional beginning. I laid out the fund's formation, my role, the evolution of governance, the recent deal. She listened, flipping through the copies I'd brought, occasionally marking a page with a small tab. "You didn't lose control," she said eventually. "You deferred execution." That distinction kept coming up. We spent hours reviewing scenarios. What could be done privately? What would trigger disclosure? What carried risk? And what simply restored balance? Every answer came with conditions, not guarantees. That suited me. By the time I left, the sun had shifted positions, and my head felt clearer than it had in weeks. No adrenaline, no anger, just structure. Back home, the signs started appearing. An email account showed a login attempt from a device I didn't recognize. Password reset requests followed, spaced just far enough apart to seem accidental. I changed credentials again, this time routing alerts through a separate channel. A former colleague called one evening under the pretense of catching up. "People are asking questions," he said, "about you. What kind? Whether you're still involved." I thanked him for the heads up and ended the call without elaboration. The pattern was familiar now. Quiet inquiries, soft pressure, enough to see who talked. At dinner, conversation stayed polite. She mentioned a meeting that had gone well, paused just long enough to see if I'd respond. I didn't. Plates were cleared. The topic moved on. Later, while she showered, I checked my phone. Another access alert. Another blocked attempt. Someone was paying attention. Instead of reacting, I adjusted the plan. Two-factor authentication everywhere. Redundant backups. A timeline drafted on paper, then memorized and destroyed. Preparation didn't need witnesses. C2 called midweek. "They're getting restless," he said. "Good. That's not sarcasm, is it?" "No." Silence hung for a second. "Just don't rush," he added. "They'll make mistakes if they think you're unaware." I took that advice seriously. The days settled into a rhythm. Work handled, messages answered selectively, notes kept mentally, not digitally. When someone asked a question that felt too pointed, I responded with less than they expected and more than they could challenge. One evening, her sister dropped by unannounced. She lingered in the doorway longer than usual. "You seem distant," she said. "Busy. That deal changed things." It did. She waited, then left without saying more. Before bed, I reviewed the legal memo the California attorney had sent earlier that afternoon. No dramatic language, just options, thresholds, consequences. I read it once, then again, committing key points to memory. The house grew quiet. Notifications slowed. Outside, traffic softened to a distant hum. I set my phone face down on the nightstand and reached for the notebook I'd started using again, jotting a few reminders in shorthand only I could read. When I closed it, the plan felt complete enough to hold, flexible enough to adjust. Sleep came easier than it had in a while, not because anything was resolved, but because the next steps no longer depended on anyone else noticing what I was doing. The letter arrived by courier, not email. Thick envelope, neutral return address. It sat on the kitchen counter longer than it needed to, like it had weight beyond paper. I opened it while the coffee cooled, scanning the first page before the rest followed. Emergency motion, temporary restrictions, preservation of assets. The language didn't accuse outright. It implied, suggested instability, raised concerns about interference and risk. By the third page, the message was clear enough. Until further notice, my ability to act, financially, administratively, would be constrained. Not eliminated, just narrowed to the point of suffocation. I folded the pages back into the envelope and set it aside. The house was quiet. Upstairs, a door closed softly. No reaction from me would be noticed even if it happened. Texts came in after that. Family members checking in, not to ask what happened, but to ask why I'd let things get this far. Friends forwarded articles that framed the situation without my voice in it. Colleagues stopped calling altogether. At lunch, her father called. "You need to think about the family," he said. "Dragging this out won't help anyone." "I'm not dragging anything," I replied. "Then stop pushing." The call ended without resolution. That had become the pattern. By mid-afternoon, the practical effects started showing. A transaction flagged, a signature request rerouted. An assistant I'd worked with for years apologized and said she'd been instructed to wait for further direction. From whom, she didn't say. I drove without a destination, letting traffic decide the pace. The thought that kept circling wasn't anger. It was loss, not of money or position, but of ground. The slow realization that everything I'd protected by staying quiet was already gone. Back home, a small stack of boxes sat near the door. My things. Files I'd kept in shared spaces. Framed photos from offices I no longer had access to. Nothing dramatic, just curated absence. She stood in the hallway when I walked in. "This didn't have to happen," she said. "It already did. You're making it worse." I didn't respond. The words were familiar. They always arrived after decisions were made, never before. Dinner passed with forced normalcy, talk of schedules, travel, nothing related to the envelope still on the counter. When the dishes were done, she mentioned a meeting scheduled for the following week, a hearing. "Preliminary," she said. "Routine. You don't need to attend," she added. "My attorneys will handle it." That was the moment something shifted. Not loudly, just enough. I went to the study and closed the door. The envelope came back out. This time, I read every line carefully, noting what was stated and what was assumed. Fear crept in around the edges, not panic, something colder. The awareness that if I kept yielding space, there wouldn't be any left to stand on. C2 called as I was finishing the last page. "They moved faster than I expected," he said. "They think I won't respond." "Are they right?" I looked at the notes I'd made in the margins. Dates, gaps, overreach disguised as protection. "No," I said. He exhaled, slow. "Then we proceed." After the call, I sat alone for a while, letting the house settle. The sounds were ordinary. Footsteps upstairs, a drawer opening. Life continuing as if nothing fundamental had changed. I thought about the version of myself that would have absorbed this quietly, smoothed things over, waited for permission. That version had believed endurance was enough. The phone buzzed again. Another message I didn't open. I stood, slipped the envelope into my bag, and grabbed my keys. Not to confront anyone, not to explain, just to move. The car started on the first turn. As I pulled out of the driveway, a single thought held steady, not as a declaration, but as a calculation. What it would take to stop losing ground, and who would notice when I finally stopped stepping back. The call came from a number I hadn't seen in years. I answered without thinking, more out of habit than expectation. "I didn't know if you'd remember me," the man said. His name took a second to place. We'd worked together during the early formation of the fund, back when titles were fluid and everyone did more than one job. He'd left quietly, no drama, just a handshake and a promise to stay in touch that neither of us kept. "I remember," I said. "What's going on?" He hesitated, then spoke with the kind of care people use when they know a conversation can't be taken back. "I've been following what's happening," he said, "and some of what's being said isn't accurate." We met 2 days later in a quiet office space he'd borrowed from a friend. No lawyers, no formalities, just two men sitting across from each other, papers spread between us. He didn't dramatize anything, just walked me through his role back then, the meetings he'd attended, the decisions he'd witnessed. He confirmed what the documents suggested but couldn't prove on their own. My involvement hadn't been symbolic, it had been structural. "You were never removed," he said. "You stepped aside because you trusted the process." Trust. That word felt heavier now than it ever had. He agreed to sign a sworn statement, no conditions, no bargaining. Said he was tired of watching the story bend itself around convenience. When I left, I didn't feel relief. I felt alignment. Like something inside had finally stopped pulling in opposite directions. Back home, the atmosphere stayed unchanged on the surface. She moved through her routines with confidence, speaking openly on calls, dropping hints about outcomes as if they were already decided. Her certainty had grown sharper, less guarded. That told me more than any argument could. At dinner, she mentioned the upcoming hearing again, this time with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "It'll be quick," she said. "Just formalities." I nodded and kept eating. Behind the scenes, things continued tightening. Emails went unanswered. Requests stalled. Yet every move she made assumed I'd remain reactive, emotional, late. That was the miscalculation. C2 reviewed the statement the next morning. He didn't comment right away, just read it through once, then again. "This closes the loop," he said. "They can still posture, but the foundation shifts now." "How exposed am I?" I asked. "Less than they think," he replied. "More than you were." We mapped the next steps carefully. What to file, what to hold, what to let them say publicly without correction. Timing mattered more than volume. The following days felt oddly calm. Pressure remained, but it no longer dictated my breathing. When her legal team sent over another notice, this one more aggressive in tone, I forwarded it without comment. She watched me more closely after that. Questions came disguised as concern. "You've been quiet," she said one evening. "I've been listening." "To who?" "Everyone." She didn't like that answer. A message from the witness came in later that night, confirming availability if needed. I saved it, then closed the app. No need to revisit it yet. Instead, I focused on the small things, organizing files, returning calls selectively, keeping my schedule ordinary enough not to invite suspicion. Preparation didn't require secrecy so much as consistency. At one point, her attorney requested a meeting, not a summons, an invitation. I declined. That refusal landed harder than any argument would have. It shifted the dynamic just enough to be felt. The follow-up email came quicker than expected, firmer in tone. I read it once and deleted it. The night before the hearing, I laid out everything on the desk. Documents arranged by sequence, not importance. Notes trimmed down to facts. No commentary, no framing. Looking at it all together, the pattern was unmistakable. Not malicious in the way people imagine, but deliberate, incremental, designed for someone who wouldn't push back. I closed the folder and set it aside. In the other room, she was on the phone, voice steady, assured. I caught fragments of sentences as I passed the doorway, confidence built on the assumption that I'd stay where I was placed. I went to the kitchen, poured a glass of water, and checked my phone one last time. A short message from C2 waited there. Ready when you are. I set the phone down, turned off the light, and headed back toward the bedroom, already running through the morning ahead without attaching emotion to any of it. The call came from a number I hadn't seen in years. I answered without thinking, more out of habit than expectation. "I didn't know if you'd remember me," the man said. His name took a second to place. We'd worked together during the early formation of the fund, back when titles were fluid and everyone did more than one job. He'd left quietly, no drama, just a handshake and a promise to stay in touch that neither of us kept. "I remember," I said. "What's going on?" He hesitated, then spoke with the kind of care people use when they know a conversation can't be taken back. "I've been following what's happening," he said, "and some of what's being said isn't accurate." We met 2 days later in a quiet office space he'd borrowed from a friend. No lawyers, no formalities, just two men sitting across from each other, papers spread between us. He didn't dramatize anything, just walked me through his role back then, the meetings he'd attended, the decisions he'd witnessed. He confirmed what the documents suggested, but couldn't prove on their own. My involvement hadn't been symbolic, it had been structural. "You were never removed," he said. "You stepped aside because you trusted the process." Trust. That word felt heavier now than it ever had. He agreed to sign a sworn statement. No conditions, no bargaining. Said he was tired of watching the story bend itself around convenience. When I left, I didn't feel relief. I felt alignment. Like something inside had finally stopped pulling in opposite directions. Back home, the atmosphere stayed unchanged on the surface. She moved through her routines with confidence, speaking openly on calls, dropping hints about outcomes as if they were already decided. Her certainty had grown sharper, less guarded. That told me more than any argument could. At dinner, she mentioned the upcoming hearing again, this time with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "It'll be quick," she said. "Just formalities." I nodded and kept eating. Behind the scenes, things continued tightening. Emails went unanswered. Requests stalled. Yet every move she made assumed I'd remain reactive, emotional, late. That was the miscalculation. C2 reviewed the statement the next morning. He didn't comment right away, just read it through once, then again. "This closes the loop," he said. "They can still posture, but the foundation shifts now." "How exposed am I?" I asked. "Less than they think," he replied. "More than you were." We mapped the next steps carefully. What to file, what to hold, what to let them say publicly without correction. Timing mattered more than volume. The following days felt oddly calm. Pressure remained, but it no longer dictated my breathing. When her legal team sent over another notice, this one more aggressive in tone, I forwarded it without comment. She watched me more closely after that. Questions came disguised as concern. "You've been quiet," she said one evening. "I've been listening." "To who?" "Everyone." She didn't like that answer. A message from the witness came in later that night, confirming availability if needed. I saved it, then closed the app. No need to revisit it yet. Instead, I focused on the small things, organizing files, returning calls selectively, keeping my schedule ordinary enough not to invite suspicion. Preparation didn't require secrecy so much as consistency. At one point, her attorney requested a meeting, not a summons, an invitation. I declined. That refusal landed harder than any argument would have. It shifted the dynamic just enough to be felt. The follow-up email came quicker than expected, firmer in tone. I read it once and deleted it. The night before the hearing, I laid out everything on the desk. Documents arranged by sequence, not importance. Notes trimmed down to facts. No commentary, no framing. Looking at it all together, the pattern was unmistakable. Not malicious in the way people imagine, but deliberate, incremental, designed for someone who wouldn't push back. I closed the folder and set it aside. In the other room, she was on the phone, voice steady, assured. I caught fragments of sentences as I passed the doorway. Confidence built on the assumption that I'd stay where I was placed. I went to the kitchen, poured a glass of water, and checked my phone one last time. A short message from C2 waited there. Ready when you are. I set the phone down, turned off the light, and headed back toward the bedroom, already running through the morning ahead without attaching emotion to any of it. The room filled the way these rooms always do. People settling into their seats before the last sentence finishes. Phones face down, attention already moving to whatever comes next. I took a place near the back, not hiding, just unannounced. That felt appropriate. Applause broke out when the moderator confirmed the deal was finalized. $800 million. Hands shook. Smiles held a fraction longer than usual. My wife stood near the front with the board members, relaxed in a way that suggested the hard part was over. I stayed seated through the first wave of congratulations. Let the moment complete itself. Then I stood. Chairs creaked around me. A few heads turned, then more. The movement didn't feel dramatic from where I was, just necessary. I walked forward without hurrying, stopping where everyone could see me without my having to raise my voice. She noticed then. The pause in her expression was brief, but it existed. Long enough. "This isn't the time," she said, her tone controlled, practiced. "We can talk later." "Later won't change what's already on paper," I replied. Someone near her shifted uncomfortably. Another glance toward the legal team seated along the wall. "You're disrupting a formal announcement," she continued. "This isn't appropriate." "Neither was locking me out," I said. "But here we are." The room quieted in increments, not silence, attention. She turned slightly toward the board, as if drawing strength from proximity. "He hasn't been involved in this company for years," she said to them, not to me. "This is an emotional response." That word again. Emotional, convenient, familiar. I reached into my bag and placed a folder on the table closest to me. Didn't slide it, didn't fan it open, just set it down. "I didn't come here to argue," I said. "I came to clarify." One of the attorneys leaned forward. "Sir, if you have a concern—" "I do," I said, turning slightly. "And I also have standing." That earned a few raised brows. I opened the folder and removed the first document, holding it up just long enough for the header to register. "Founding agreement," I said. "Signed before most of you were here." I placed it back down and took out the next page. "Addendum," I continued. "Contingent voting rights, triggered by transactions above a defined threshold." A murmur rippled through the room. Subtle, but real. She stepped forward then. "This is misleading," she said. "He stepped away voluntarily." "Operationally," I replied. "Not legally." I didn't look at her while I spoke. Addressed the board instead, the people who mattered now. "I retained controlling interest through a trust," I said. "Verified last week. Verify again yesterday." One of the board members glanced at the attorney. The attorney flipped through his notes, frowning. "You should have disclosed this earlier," she said, sharper now. "I tried," I answered. "Access was restricted." That landed. Silence took hold more fully this time. Not dramatic, unavoidable. The attorney cleared his throat. "We'll need to review these documents." "You already have copies," I said. "Your office received them this morning." That wasn't a bluff. She stared at me then, really stared, as if recalculating something she'd assumed was fixed. The confidence she'd worn all evening slipped just enough to be visible. "You did this to embarrass me," she said quietly. "I did this to correct the record," I replied. Someone at the far end of the table asked a question about next steps. Another asked about authority pending review. The discussion moved quickly, away from performance and toward process. I answered what I needed to, nothing more. When it became clear that the announcement would be amended, I closed the folder and returned it to my bag. No one stopped me. No one asked for clarification. The room had shifted its focus already. I walked out the same way I'd come in, past familiar faces that now avoided my eyes. The hallway felt narrower than before, or maybe I was more aware of where I stood in it. Outside, my phone buzzed once. A message from C2. "They're scrambling." I didn't respond. Slid the phone into my pocket and kept walking, letting the noise of the city absorb whatever reactions were still happening behind me. The paperwork moved faster once the noise died down. Amendments circulated. Statements softened. Apologies arrived indirectly, folded into procedural language that avoided names. I didn't attend the follow-up meetings. My attorney did. That distance mattered. At home, the atmosphere changed first. Conversations shortened. Doors closed more often. She spoke to me like someone negotiating a ceasefire, careful not to touch anything sharp. I listened without correcting her assumptions. There was no advantage in arguing over details that were already fixed. A notice came from the bank confirming restored access, then another outlining revised authority. The words were dry, effective immediately, subject to review, the kind of phrases that sound neutral until you've been denied them. Family reactions followed predictable lines. Some called to say they'd been misled. Others asked if there was a way to move forward together. A few stayed silent, which told me enough. I returned none of the calls right away. One evening, she sat across from me at the table and asked what I wanted. "We can still talk," she said. "Figure this out." I didn't answer immediately. The question itself felt late. "I'm not interested in figuring anything out," I said. "I'm interested in finishing." That ended the conversation. Not dramatically, just conclusively. The legal consequences unfolded over weeks. Internal reviews led to resignations. A partner stepped down. Another faced questions he couldn't deflect. Nothing played out publicly the way people imagine accountability does. It was quieter than that. Careers stalled. Invitations stopped coming. Trust evaporated. I watched it all from a distance, not out of mercy, but out of clarity. None of it required my involvement anymore. What surprised me most was the absence of relief. No rush, no sense of victory, just a steadiness that hadn't been there before. The fear I'd carried, of being alone, of losing relevance, of standing without cover, had loosened its grip. Being alone turned out to be different from being isolated. I packed my things slowly, not because I was hesitant, but because I didn't want to leave pieces behind by accident. Books went into boxes, files into folders, clothes folded without ceremony. Each item carried less weight than it once had. On the last morning, the house felt smaller. Or maybe I did. I took one final walk through the rooms, checking drawers, cabinets, places where habits hide things you forget you own. Nothing remained that needed explaining. At the door, she stood off to the side. "You don't have to disappear," she said. "I'm not," I replied. "I'm just not staying." Outside, the car waited. I loaded the last box into the trunk and closed it without looking back. The engine turned over easily. That felt symbolic enough. The drive took me through streets I knew well, then onto roads that didn't ask for history. Traffic moved. Signs passed. The city receded without protest. Later that afternoon, I stopped at a quiet place by the water, sat on a bench, and let time do what it does when no one is rushing it. Messages came in. I read a few, ignored the rest. C2 sent a short note. "It's done." I replied with a single word. "Thanks." As evening approached, I stood and stretched, feeling the day catch up to me in small ways. Stiff shoulders, dry eyes, hunger. Ordinary things, manageable things. I got back into the car, adjusted the seat, and pulled back onto the road, already thinking about where I'd stay that night and what I'd handle in the morning, letting the rhythm of movement carry the rest.